Hello, welcome to this lecture video. I'm teacher Melai and let's talk about data management. The outline of data management, which is actually one of the chapter in the mathematics in the modern world, include the following. So we have data, which will consist of gathering and organizing data, representing data using graphs and charts, and interpreting organized data, followed by measures of central tendency, measures of dispersion, measures of relative position, probabilities and normal distribution, and lastly, linear regression and correlation. So the focus of this video is to consider the first one, which is the data. Okay, so here we are going to consider what are the different methods in gathering the data. Because for you to come up with your data, the first thing that you need to do is, of course, given the set of questions, given, of course, the methodology of what you're going to use, you have to, then if everything is set, you know what's your plan, what are your problems, what will you gather? Then the next thing that you need to do is to gather your data. But you have to consider what method of data gathering will you use. So here we're going to discuss the different gathering methods. So we have the interview method. So of course you might be familiar with this because maybe this is not your first time to encounter this method because you also have your statistics and research subject in your grade 11 and grade 12 or in your senior high school. So in the interview method, you have to conduct the interview. It can be either face-to-face or with the pandemic right now, or even without the pandemic, just in case that it is not possible to conduct because of the location or because of the busy schedule of your interviewee or your respondent, then you can also make use of indirect interview. For the indirect interview, this is only good to use if you have a very few questions to ask, and of course if the number of respondent is less than 30, because it is, of course, time consuming. It is also considered expensive in a way that, of course, you have to transcribe all the conversation if you're going to consider a lot of or a very large sample size, and it would be difficult for you to transcribe the conversation between you and your respondents. So again, just to highlight, we use interview method if we have a very few questions to ask, and also if we will only consider less than 30 number of respondents. Next, questionnaire. So in the using the questionnaire, so this is a well-planned question, which means that if you're going to conduct, you have to make sure that your questionnaire is valid and reliable. So you can actually adapt instrument, but make sure that it is localized, or if not, it is validated by experts. So you have to check if, of course, it answers what it intends to answer, or it measures what it intends to measure. And next, empirical observation method. So in empirical observation method, this is usually used in anthropologists or psychological studies, wherein the basis of gathering data, or they gather the data with the use of senses. So it can be based on what they see, what they smell, what they hear, what they feel, or what they touch, and also what else, as long as it's about, of course, obtained using the senses. Okay, next, registration method. So if your method, or rather your data, will come from offices that has something to do with the registration, like registrar's office, LTO, uh, NSO, or rather PSA. So you are actually using the registration method. And the use of mechanical devices, if you will gather your data with the aid of mechanical devices. So in science, for instance, they use microscope, they use weighing scales, or also in social sciences, they may also use recorder, PowerPoint laptops, so all other mechanical devices. For experiment methods, so here, of course, this is usually if you have a problem that deals with cause and effect. So for you to come up with the effect, so you have to conduct the experiment. So it is more in science, though it is also possible in other other field like in education. So they also conduct action researches, and it can be, of course, pre-experimental or experimental. Okay, so after that, after deciding what method that to use for you to gather your data, the next thing is, of course, also how will you determine for the number of your respondents? So that is determining the sample size. So I will consider here some of ways on how to determine your sample size. So the first one is you just need to make sure that your sample or the respondent is well represented, which means if you are, of course, familiar with the number of the population, the higher the population means higher number of sample size, or lower population. So if well represented is also a lower number of sample size. And also, you can make use of the central limit theorem, wherein as much as possible, the sample size is 30. Because in central limit theorem, rather, it states that the sufficiently large enough sample size in the statistics is 30. However, in case that you have, for instance, problem that deals with, let's say, problems that will deals with comparison between male and then female, then of course you also need to make sure that the number of male is at least 30 and the number of female is also at least 30. And also, aside from that, one thing more is that in central limit theorem, it does not only state that the number of sample size is 30, it also states that if in case that there is a grouping, it must be equivalent, which means the number of sample size is not far from each other. So just like, for example, for male, if there are 30 respondents, then the number of female must also be equal to 30, or if not, it can be 31, 32, or it can also be a lower value like 29. But again, if it's already doubled of the number, like 30 for male and 60 for female, then it means that there is another conditions that you need to consider. So because in the using statistics later, we are going to discuss that there is appropriate statistics. So you cannot just use any method. And then the next one is statistical minimum requirement. So in statistical minimum requirement, the minimum number for you to use a stat, for instance, if it is test for comparison, is 5. So you cannot, of course, compare one individual, one male, compared with 30 females. So you have to at least have at least a 5 number of respondents for you to compare it with other respondents. But if you are aiming for a good number, you have to opt again with the first one, the central limit theorem. Okay, so here for some tests like Pearson R, for comparison test, the minimum is 5, but for relationship like Pearson R, the minimum number is 8 to 10. But the problem here, of course, is that if you're going to consider only the minimum requirement, will not, it might not give you a very meaningful result. Okay, so here, as mentioned, you can come up with a well-represented sample size. You may use central limit theorem by considering 30 sample size, or if you will consider grouping, it is approximately, or it is equivalent for each group. And then for statistical minimum requirement, if it is for comparison, it is 5, while for relationship, it is 8 to 10 minimum. Okay, so you can also make use of software in determining for the sample size, like the G power. So we are going to have a separate video for the G power. Or you can also make use of online sample size calculator to come up for your respondent. So what is the website that we can use? So actually, so we can make use of this website. So it's a calculator.net dash sample size. So I will place this also in the PowerPoint presentation. Let us transfer this for you to be guided later on. So you can also open this. This is online calculator of sample size. So here, you can provide confidence level. So usually for confidence level, it ranges from 95 to 99%. Margin of error, usually we use 1 to 5%. Population proportion, if you are not sure about the population proportion of, this is the proportion of like you have an idea of the result, like they will say yes to your survey, or they will say no. That majority of them, for instance, that 75% of them will say yes, then the population proportion is 70%. Or here you can just set it into 50 if you are not sure of the population proportion. And then for the population size, if you know what is the population size, then you can place it here. But if you are not aware, or if it's unlimited, you do not have the data, then you can just leave it blank. Okay, so let us consider. So what we will do is to set it to 95. So if you, as you can see here, there are a lot of options, but the most common confidence level used is 95 to 99%. So let's just consider, for instance, 95% for the margin of error. So let's set it to 5%. And for the population size, so if we're going to leave this a blank and then click calculate, so let's do that. So let's click calculate. So what will be the result? So it's a 385 sample size. But if you have, for example, an idea that the population is only 100 and then calculate it, it will give you a number equal to, so let's click calculate again. Okay, let's set it to 5%, 50%, and population is 100. Then click calculate. So it is equal to 80. So as you observe here, so if you set it to unlimited population size, which means that you are not aware because it's a very large sample size, it will give you a very large sample size also. But if you have, of course, the number or the actual number, then you can just set the population size here. So that is how to use this sample size calculator. So what you need to do is just to report the value of the sample size and consider